Welcome to our deep dive into the world of eating disorders.
Sounds fascinating.
It is, and today we're exploring this book called Eating Disorders. It's part of the WPA series, Evidence and Experience in Psychiatry.
Okay.
It's really cool because it's a collection of insights from all these different experts.
Uh-huh.
It gives you a super comprehensive view of eating disorders, like their history, diagnosis, everything really.
I see. So what's the main focus of our deep dive today?
Well, we're going to take a journey through time, see how our understanding of eating disorders has evolved.
A historical perspective.
Yeah, exactly. And then we'll unpack all the complexities around, classifying these conditions.
Right, because it's not always straightforward, is it?
Not at all.
Oh.
And of course, we'll dig into all the debates about the causes and treatment of eating disorders.
Sounds like a lot to cover.
It is, but it's so important. It's crazy how we often think of eating disorders as a modern problem.
Yeah, you're right.
But this book takes us all the way back to the 17th century.
Wow, that's a long history.
I know. Back then, they attributed eating disorders to things like female humors. Can you believe that?
Female humors. That's a term I haven't heard in a while.
Right. It just shows how much our understanding has changed.
For sure. I mean, imagine a doctor today saying something like that.
Totally. And the book actually shares the story of Martha Taylor, an 18-year-old back in the 1600s. She fasted for an entire year.
A whole year.
Yeah. And back then, they interpreted her condition through these beliefs about female humors.
It's amazing how these early beliefs shaped the way eating disorders were perceived, isn't it?
It really is. And it wasn't until the 19th century that physicians like Richard Morton started recognizing anorexia nervosa as a distinct medical condition, separate from things like consumption.
Richard Morton, wasn't he a prominent figure in the field?
Yeah, he was. His work was so detailed and really helped to pave the way for a more medicalized approach. And then towards the end of the 19th century, the term anorexia nervosa was finally coined.
That marked a big shift in our thinking, right?
A huge shift. It's in so many areas of medicine, things that were once seen as, supernatural or mysterious are now recognized as having biological and psychological roots.
Absolutely. So how does all of this historical context relate to how we diagnose eating disorders today?
That's a great question. The DSM and ICD, those are the systems we use today, and they have specific criteria for diagnosing things like anorexia and bulimia.
Right.
But even now, there's this debate about whether amenorrhea should be a required criterion for anorexia.
Oh, interesting. What are the arguments there?
Well, some experts believe it's a core symptom, directly tied to hormonal disruptions from starvation. But others think it's just a consequence of low body weight and not essential for a diagnosis.
So it's still a complex issue.
Very much so. And classifying eating disorders can be a real challenge. There's so much overlap between different types.
And sometimes people just don't fit neatly into any category.
Exactly. That's where eating disorder is not otherwise specified, or EDNOS, comes in.
Ah, yes. The catch-all category.
Pretty much. But it does raise questions about the limitations of our current diagnostic system, doesn't it?
It does. I mean, if so many people don't fit neatly into the existing categories, maybe we need to rethink our approach.
Some experts suggest a dimensional approach might be more accurate and clinically helpful.
Interesting. So instead of labeling someone as, say, anorexic or bulimic, we'd assess them on a spectrum.
That's the idea. It would allow for a more personalized understanding of each person's struggles.
I see. That makes a lot of sense. Now, for a long time, eating disorders were viewed as culture-bound syndromes, mostly seen in Western societies.
Like a product of affluence and all those media images promoting thinness.
Right. But this book challenges that idea. It shows that eating disorders are on the rise in developing countries, too.
There are studies from places like Brazil and Egypt showing that these conditions aren't limited by geography or culture.
It's a global issue, then.
It really is. And it makes you wonder if the increase is because there are actually more cases, or if we're just getting better at recognizing and diagnosing them.
Probably a bit of both, I'd imagine.
Probably, but it definitely debunks the idea that eating disorders are solely a product of Western culture.
Agreed. Now, what about the role of media? I mean, it's hard to deny the influence of those images we see all the time.
It is, but the research on the direct impact of media on eating disorders is actually pretty inconclusive.
That's interesting.
It's kind of a chicken and egg situation, isn't it?
How so?
Well, do media images cause eating disorders, or are people who are already vulnerable to these conditions just more sensitive to those messages?
Ah, I see what you mean. It's a complex interplay of factors.
Exactly. We can't oversimplify it. Okay, now let's talk about the serious medical complications that can arise from eating disorders.
Okay.
It's important to understand that these complications aren't just about being thin.
Right.
They often stem from nutritional deficiencies and the body's response to starvation.
Many people don't realize that electrolyte imbalances, for instance, can be life-threatening.
Absolutely. And things like purging only make those imbalances worse.
It's really crucial to understand how damaging starvation can be to the body. It affects everything.
Everything. So let's break it down a little. Can you explain what actually happens when the body's deprived of essential nutrients?
Well, essentially, the body goes into survival mode.
Yeah.
It tries to conserve energy any way it can. So your metabolism slows down, your heart rate drops, your blood pressure decreases, even your body temperature goes down.
It's like the body's going into hibernation.
Yeah, kinda. But, unlike a bear hibernating for the winter, this kind of starvation really wreaks havoc on your organs.
It's not healthy at all.
Not at all. It messes with your hormones. It can even affect your brain function.
It's scary how much damage it can do. The book goes into detail about how purging, like through chronic vomiting, can really damage the esophagus.
Oh, yeah. It can lead to ulcers,
Mm.
even tooth decay.
And laxative abuse can mess up your colon. It's a whole cascade of negative effects.
It is. And we haven't even touched on the long-term consequences for bone health.
Osteoporosis, right.
Exactly. That's a major concern, especially for people who experience amenorrhea or, prolonged starvation during adolescence.
Because that's when your bones are still developing.
That's right. If you're not getting enough calcium and other nutrients during those critical years, it can have lasting effects.
It's a powerful reminder that eating disorders are serious medical conditions, not just about, wanting to be thin.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Treating the physical complications is just as important as addressing the psychological aspects.
No doubt about it. So before we move on, any key takeaways you want to emphasize for our listeners about these physical consequences?
I think the most important thing is to understand that eating disorders are not about vanity. They have real medical consequences that can affect every single system in your body.
Early intervention is so important.
Absolutely. The sooner someone receives treatment, the less likely they are to experience those long-term health problems. And if you or someone you know is showing signs of an eating disorder, don't wait to seek help.
We'll have links to some resources in our show notes too. Now, this book also talks about different treatment approaches for eating disorders. It emphasizes the importance of a multidisciplinary approach. Can you tell us a bit more about what that means?
Sure. A multidisciplinary approach basically means having a team of professionals involved.
Okay.
So you'd have therapists, doctors, nutritionists, sometimes even psychiatrists, all working together.
I see. So it's not just about talk therapy or just focusing on nutrition. It's about looking at the whole picture.
Exactly. For example, medications like antidepressants can be helpful for bulimia, but not so much for anorexia.
And then there are therapies like CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, and family therapy.
Right. Those can be very effective, especially for younger people.
Can you explain a little bit about how CBT works for eating disorders?
Well, CBT helps people challenge their thoughts and beliefs about food, weight, and body image.
It's about changing the way they think about those things.
Yeah, and it helps them develop healthier coping mechanisms and ways to manage their emotions without resorting to disordered eating behaviors.
That makes sense. And family therapy that involves the whole family, right?
Yes. It's a way to educate the family about the eating disorder and give them tools to support their loved one during recovery.
It's about creating a more supportive environment.
Exactly. And nutritional counseling is another key component.
Right.
A registered dietitian can be so helpful in guiding someone towards a healthier relationship with food.
I see. They can, bust myths about dieting and stuff.
Yeah, and create a meal plan that supports recovery.
It seems like individualized care is really important in treating eating disorders.
It is. There's no one-size-fits-all approach.
Yeah.
Every person's needs are different, and the treatment should reflect that.
This book is honest about the fact that treatment can be tough and relapse is common.
You're right. It's important to be realistic. Recovery is a journey, not a quick fix.
And setbacks are normal.
They are. They don't mean failure. They just mean you might need to adjust the treatment plan.
So it's about having ongoing support, right?
Definitely. Support groups, therapy, regular checkups, all of those things can make a huge difference.
Now, I know the book also delves into some of the biological aspects of eating disorders. It talks about how genetics, neurochemicals, and hormones play a role.
Yes, that's a fascinating area of research.
What are some of the key findings in this area?
Well, there's growing evidence suggesting that some genes may make people more susceptible to developing eating disorders.
So it's not just a matter of willpower, like we were saying earlier. There's a biological component, too.
Exactly. It's not as simple as saying this gene causes anorexia, but it does show that biology plays a part.
And then there's the research on neurochemicals like serotonin and dopamine, which are involved in the brain's reward system, right?
Yeah. We're learning that in people with eating disorders, the brain's reward system can get sort of hijacked.
Hijacked.
In a way, yes. Behaviors like restricting or binging become really reinforcing, even though they're harmful in the long run.
It's almost like an addiction to those behaviors, even though they're not drugs.
That's a good way to put it.
And then there's the research on hormones like leptin and ghrelin, which are involved in regulating hunger and fullness.
Right. Those hormones play a crucial role in telling your brain when you're hungry and when you're full. And in people with eating disorders, that communication can get disrupted.
So their body's natural hunger and fullness signals get messed up.
Basically, yes.
Yeah.
The communication between the brain and the gut gets thrown off, making it much harder to regulate food intake normally.
It's incredible how much we're learning about these intricate systems and how they're affected by eating disorders.
It is. And this knowledge is so important for developing more effective treatments and prevention strategies.
Now, the book also touches on the economic and social burden of eating disorders.
You know, these disorders don't just affect the individual.
Right. They have ripple effects.
Exactly. They affect families, communities, healthcare systems. It's a much broader issue.
The book actually says that the economic burden of eating disorders is comparable to that of serious mental illnesses like schizophrenia.
That's right. And those costs are huge.
It's not just medical expenses either.
No, it's lost productivity, disability benefits, the strain on families and caregivers. It all adds up.
And then there are the social and interpersonal costs, which can be
Okay.
really hard to measure.
Absolutely. These disorders can damage relationships, limit career opportunities, and seriously impact a person's quality of life.
It's a powerful reminder that eating disorders are not just personal struggles. They have wide-ranging consequences for society as a whole.
You're absolutely right. And to address this burden, we need a multifaceted approach. Prevention, early intervention, affordable treatment options, and continued research are all crucial.
Well said. You know, we've covered a lot of ground in this first part of our deep dive, but it feels like we've just scratched the surface.
We have. Eating disorders are incredibly complex, and there's still so much to learn and understand.
But I think we've laid a good foundation for understanding the history, the diagnostic challenges, and the very real physical and psychological impacts of these conditions. And most importantly, we've highlighted that there's help available and that recovery is possible.
I agree. That's the message we really want to get across.
Absolutely. Now, before we wrap up this first part, I want to leave our listeners with something to ponder.
Yeah.
Given how complex eating disorders are and the role that societal pressures play, I'm curious, how can we as a society challenge those norms and media portrayals that contribute to body image dissatisfaction and the development of these conditions?
That's a great question. It's a huge challenge, but it's something we need to be talking about and working towards. We need to start by recognizing how pervasive these pressures are and how they affect us all, whether we realize it or not. We need to promote body positivity and celebrate diversity in all its forms.
And we need to encourage media literacy so people can critically evaluate those messages and develop a more resilient sense of self-worth that's not based on external validation.
It's a long road ahead, but I think it's a journey worth taking.
I agree. Stay tuned for part 2 of our deep dive, where we'll continue to explore this vital topic. Welcome back to part 2 of our deep dive into the world of eating disorders. We were just talking about how complex and multi-layered the issue of eating disorders is, and I think that leads us perfectly into this next section, which focuses on treatment. You know, this book, Eating Disorders, really emphasizes the importance of a multidisciplinary approach.
Right, and I think that's so key because it really acknowledges the fact that these disorders are not just about food or weight.
Exactly. They're about, the whole person, their thoughts, their feelings, their behaviors, their physical health.
Everything is interconnected. So a multidisciplinary approach basically means you have a team of professionals all working together. You've got therapists, doctors, nutritionists, sometimes even psychiatrists, all collaborating to help the individual.
So it's not just about talk therapy or just focusing on what they're eating. It's about addressing all those different aspects, right?
Absolutely. The therapist helps the person explore the underlying psychological and emotional issues that might be contributing to the eating disorder, while the doctor monitors their physical health, makes sure they're medically stable, and manages any complications. And then the nutritionist helps them develop a healthy relationship with food, dispelling myths about dieting and stuff like that.
So it's really about creating a personalized plan that addresses each person's unique needs.
Exactly. One size definitely does not fit all when it comes to treating eating disorders. Now, the book talks about different types of therapy that can be helpful, like cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT.
Oh, yeah, I've heard of CBT.
It's a very common and effective approach for eating disorders because it helps people challenge their distorted thoughts and beliefs. You know, those thoughts that tell them they're not good enough unless they're thin, or that their worth is tied to their weight.
So it's about changing the way they think about those things, breaking those unhealthy thought patterns.
That's the idea. It helps them learn how to think more realistically and develop healthier coping mechanisms. And then there's family therapy, which can be especially important for adolescents.
I was going to ask about that. How does that work exactly?
Well, it involves the whole family in the treatment process, educating them about eating disorders, and teaching them how to support their loved one's recovery.
So it's not just about the individual who's struggling, it's about creating a supportive and understanding environment for them.
Exactly. It helps the family understand that the eating disorder is not the person's fault and that they can all work together to support recovery.
And of course, there's nutritional counseling too, right?
Absolutely. A registered dietitian is a key part of the treatment team. They can help the individual develop a healthy relationship with food, providing education about proper nutrition, debunking those diet myths.
I feel like there are so many myths out there about food and weight loss.
There are. And a dietitian can help sort through all of that and create a personalized meal plan that meets the person's nutritional needs.
I think it's important to highlight the fact that this book doesn't shy away from talking about how challenging treatment can be.
Yeah, it doesn't sugarcoat it. Recovery from an eating disorder is a long and complex process, and there can be setbacks along the way.
It's not a quick fix.
Definitely not. It takes time, patience, and a huge amount of commitment.
But it sounds like having that support system in place, the therapists, the doctors, the nutritionists, the family, that can make a big difference.
It really can. Ongoing support and monitoring are so important throughout the recovery journey. Now let's talk about the biological aspects of eating disorders for a bit. This book delves into some really interesting research about the role of genetics, neurochemicals, and hormones.
It's fascinating stuff. What are some of the key things that scientists are learning in this area?
Well, one of the most significant findings is that certain genes may make some individuals more susceptible to developing eating disorders. Now, it's not as simple as saying, if you have this gene, you'll get anorexia, but it does suggest that there's a biological predisposition for some people.
So it's not just about personality or willpower, there's an actual biological component at play.
Exactly. And research on neurochemicals like serotonin and dopamine, which are involved in the brain's reward system, has also been really illuminating.
So how does that tie into eating disorders?
Well, it turns out that in people with eating disorders, the brain's reward system can kind of get hijacked.
Hijacked. How do you mean?
Well, behaviors like restricting food intake or binging can actually trigger a release of these reward chemicals in the brain, creating a sense of pleasure or relief.
So even though those behaviors are ultimately harmful, the brain is getting tricked into thinking they're good.
That's a good way to put it. And because the brain loves those reward chemicals, it starts to crave those behaviors more and more, creating a vicious cycle.
That makes sense. And what about hormones, like those involved in regulating hunger and fullness?
Right. Hormones like leptin and ghrelin play a key role in signaling to your brain when you're hungry and when you're full. But in people with eating disorders, that communication system can get disrupted.
So their body's natural hunger and fullness cues get messed up.
Exactly. They might not feel hungry when they should be, or they might feel overly full even after eating a small amount. This can make it incredibly difficult to regulate food intake in a healthy way.
It sounds like there's a lot more going on in the brain and body than we might realize when it comes to eating disorders.
Absolutely. And as scientists continue to unravel these complex biological mechanisms, it will hopefully lead to even more targeted and effective treatments.
Now, shifting gears a bit, I want to touch on the economic and social burden of eating disorders. These disorders don't just affect the individual struggling, they have a much broader impact.
You're absolutely right. It's something that often gets overlooked. People tend to think of it as a personal problem, but the ripple effects are huge.
This book actually compares the economic burden of eating disorders to that of serious mental illnesses like schizophrenia.
That's right, and we're talking about huge costs here.
So what contributes to those costs? It can't just be treatment expenses, right?
No, it's much more than that.
Yeah.
You've got the direct cost of medical treatment, of course, but you also have to factor in things like lost productivity, disability benefits, the strain on families and caregivers.
And the social costs, those are harder to measure, but just as significant.
Absolutely. Eating disorders can damage relationships, limit career prospects, and impact someone's overall quality of life.
It can lead to isolation, shame, stigma, all of which make it even harder to seek help and recover.
Exactly. It's a vicious cycle, and it highlights the need for us to approach eating disorders from a public health perspective, not just as an individual issue.
We need prevention programs, early intervention initiatives, affordable and accessible treatment options, and we need to continue funding research to better understand these complex conditions.
Couldn't agree more. And I think it all starts with raising awareness, changing those societal norms that contribute to body dissatisfaction, and promoting body positivity.
So that people can feel comfortable and confident in their own skin, regardless of their size or shape.
That's the goal. We all deserve to feel good about ourselves and live healthy, fulfilling lives.
Welcome back to the final part of our deep dive into the world of eating disorders. We've covered a lot of ground, exploring the history, the diagnosis, the impacts of eating disorders, and we've even delved into treatment and those biological factors that can contribute to these conditions.
Yeah, it's been really eye-opening to see just how complex these disorders really are. There's so many layers involved.
There are, and one of the things that has really struck me throughout our conversations is how deeply ingrained these societal pressures are, especially when it comes to body image. We talked earlier about how those pressures, combined with individual vulnerabilities, can create like this perfect storm for the development of eating disorders.
Yeah, it's true. And it can be so hard to recognize those pressures.
Yeah.
Like to see how they're actually influencing our thoughts and behaviors.
It's like they become so normalized, so ingrained in our culture that we don't even question them anymore. We just absorb these messages about what's supposed to be attractive, what's desirable, what success looks like. And so much of it revolves around these very narrow, unrealistic ideals.
And those ideals are constantly being reinforced. We see them in the media, in advertising, on social media, even in our own families and communities sometimes.
It's everywhere, and it's so insidious. This book, Eating Disorders, really illustrates how those messages can interact with individual vulnerabilities. For example, we know that certain personality traits like perfectionism or a strong need for control can increase the risk of developing an eating disorder.
Right, and then you layer in things like family dynamics, life stressors, maybe difficult relationships, or just the normal challenges of growing up. And it's no wonder that some people become more susceptible than others.
It's all these different factors converge, and for some individuals, it creates a vulnerability, a kind of tipping point where an eating disorder can take hold.
It's never just one thing. It's this complex interplay of internal and external forces.
So as we wrap up our deep dive, what are some key takeaways you'd want to leave our listeners with?
Well, I think the most important message is that eating disorders are not a choice. They are serious medical conditions, and they deserve to be treated with the same level of care and compassion as any other illness.
It's so important to dispel those myths and misconceptions, the idea that it's just about vanity or a lack of willpower.
It's not about that at all.
Yeah.
These are complex illnesses, and they can have devastating consequences if they're not addressed.
And on that note, it's so crucial to remember that recovery is possible. We don't want anyone to lose hope.
Absolutely. Many, many people go on to live full and healthy lives after overcoming an eating disorder. It takes time and effort and support, but recovery is absolutely within reach.
And there is help available. We really want to encourage anyone who's struggling or anyone who knows someone who's struggling to reach out for help.
There are so many resources available, therapists, doctors, nutritionists, support groups, hotlines. You don't have to go through this alone.
Exactly. And we'll make sure to link to some of those resources in our show notes for anyone who wants to learn more.
And I think another really important takeaway from our deep dive is the need to challenge those societal norms and pressures that contribute to body dissatisfaction and eating disorders in the first place.
It's about creating a culture that celebrates diversity, promotes body positivity, and encourages people to feel good about themselves regardless of their size or shape.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
We need to be more mindful of the messages we're sending to young people, and we need to challenge those unrealistic beauty standards that are constantly being promoted.
We can all play a part in creating a more supportive and inclusive environment where everyone feels valued and accepted.
It's about shifting those cultural norms and expectations so that body image doesn't become such a central focus and people can feel free to just be themselves.
Well said. Well, we've come to the end of our deep dive into the world of eating disorders.
It's been a really thought-provoking conversation.
It has. We've covered so much ground from the historical roots to the latest scientific research, and we've really tried to convey the complexity, the challenges, and the hope that surrounds these conditions.
And I hope our listeners have come away with a better understanding of these disorders and feel empowered to seek help if they need it or to support someone they know who might be struggling.
That's what it's all about. So, to our listeners, thank you for joining us on this journey. We encourage you to continue exploring this important topic, and we'll see you on our next deep dive.